It always does seem to me that I'm doing more work than I should do. It's not that I object to work, mind you. I like work. It fascinates me. I can sit and look at it for hours. I love to keep it always by me. The idea of getting rid of it nearly breaks my heart. But although I crave for work, I do like to be fair. I do not ask for more than my proper share, but I get it without asking for it, and this worries me. We settled the present difficulty by agreeing that George and Harris should take the boat up to Reading, and I should tow it on from there. But at Reading Lock, we came upon some friends of mine with a steam launch, and they towed us up to Streatley. It's very delightful being towed by launch. I prefer it myself to rowing. We stayed 2 days at Streatley and got our clothes washed. We tried washing them ourselves in the river, but it had been a failure. In fact, we were worse off after we washed our clothes than before. Before we washed our clothes, they were very, very dirty, it is true, but they were just wearable. After we'd washed our clothes, well, the river between Reading and Henley was a great deal cleaner after we'd washed our clothes than before. All the dirt in the river we got together in that wash and worked it into the clothes. The washerwoman at Streatley said she'd have to charge us just 3 times the usual amount for that wash. She said it hadn't been like washing, it had been more in the nature of excavating. We paid the bill without a murmur. One evening at Streatley, George and I dropped into a little riverside inn for a rest. We began chatting to an old man with a clay pipe. It somehow came out that we were strangers in the district and were going away the following morning. After that, there was a lull in the conversation, and we let our eyes wander about the room until they fell upon a dusty old glass case, high up on the wall above the chimney-piece, containing a trout. It rather fascinated me, that trout. It was such a monstrous fish. "Ah, fine fella that, ain't he?" said the man. "Quite uncommon," I murmured, and George asked him how much he thought it weighed. 18 pound and 6 ounces. Yes, it were 16 year ago, come the 3rd of next month as I caught him. I landed him just below the lock on a minnow. They told me he were in the river, and I said I'd have him. Oh, and I did. Oh, you don't get so many fish of that size round these parts now. Well, good night, gentlemen, good night. We couldn't take our eyes off the fish after that. It really was the most remarkable fish. We were still looking at it when the local carrier came in, and he too looked at the fish. "A fair-sized trout, that," said George. "Oh, you may well say that, sir," said the man. "Oh, maybe you wasn't in these parts, sir, when that fish came to be caught." "No," we said, "we were strangers." "Oh, well then, of course, how should you?" "Yes, it were nearly 5 year ago as I caught that trout." Oh, it was you who caught it, was it?" we said. "Yes, I landed him just below the bridge, and the remarkable thing about it was that I caught him on a fly. I'd gone out pike fishing, bless you, never thinking of a trout, and when that whopper came onto the end of my line, well, blessed if it didn't fair take me aback. Well, you see, he weighed 24 pounds. After he'd gone, a third man came in and told us how he'd caught it early one morning. And when he'd left, a solemn, stolid-looking, middle-aged gentleman came in and sat down by the window. There was silence for a few moments, and then George said, "Excuse me, I do beg your pardon. I hope you'll forgive the liberty from perfect strangers to the district, but we would be most awfully obliged if you'd tell us how you came to catch that trout out there." "But bless my soul, who on earth told you I'd caught that trout?" was the surprised reply. We said no one had told us. We just somehow instinctively felt that it was he who had done it. "It's the most remarkable thing," he said, "because as a matter of fact I did catch it." "But fancy your knowing it like that. It really is most remarkable." And then he told us how it had taken him half an hour to land, and it had broken his rod, and he said he'd weighed it carefully, and it had turned the scales at 35 pounds. After he'd gone, the landlord came in, and we told him the various histories we'd heard about his fish, and he was most amused, and we all laughed heartily. Oh, fancy Jim Bates and Joe Muggles and Mr. Jones and old Billy Maunders all telling you as they'd caught it. Oh, yes, they're just the sort to let me hang it up in my bar parlour if they'd caught the fish. And then he told us the real history of the fish. It seems he'd caught it when he was quite a lad. By their unaccountable good fortune, it seems to wait upon a young boy when he plays wag from school and goes fishing on a summer afternoon with a piece of string tied to the end of a tree. He said bringing that fish home had saved him from a whacking. He was called out of the room at that moment, and we turned our eyes once more upon the fish. It really was the most remarkable fish. The more we looked at it, the more we marvelled at it. It so fascinated George that he climbed up on the back of a chair to get a closer look at it. And then the chair slipped, and he clutched wildly at the trout case, and down it came with a crash, George and the chair on top of it. "You haven't injured the fish, have you?" I said. "I hope not," said George. But he had. That trout lay shattered into 1,000 fragments. I say 1,000, there may only have been 900, I didn't count them. We thought it strange and unaccountable that a stuffed trout should break up into so many pieces like that. And so it would have been strange and unaccountable if it had been a stuffed trout, but it wasn't. That trout was plaster of Paris. We left Streatley the following morning, and after a night under canvas at Culham, we rode on towards Oxford. The crowd at Cleeve Lock reminded me of an accident that George and I nearly had one summer morning at Hampton Court. It was a glorious day. The lock was crowded, and a speculative photographer was preparing to take a photograph of us as we lay upon the rising water. Every person in the lock seemed suddenly to have been turned wooden. The girls were all smiling, and the men were looking stern and noble. Our boat was at the front, and I took up a position in the prow and leant with careless grace upon the hitcher. We all stood there, waiting for the eventful moment, when I suddenly heard a voice from behind call out, "Hi! Look to your nose!" I couldn't look round to see what the matter was, or whose nose was to be looked at. I stole a sidelong glance at George's, and it seemed all right. I squinted down at mine, and it was everything that could be expected of it. "Hi! Look to your nose!" said the same voice. And then another voice called out, "Push your nose out, can't you? You two with the dog!" George and I didn't dare look round. Well, the photograph would be taken any moment. But what was the matter? Was it us they were shouting at? What was wrong with our noses? Why were they to be pushed out? But now the whole lock was in uproar, and a stentorian voice from the back called out, "Look at your boat, sir! You two with the black and red caps! It'll be your two corpses that get in that photo if you ain't quick!" George and I looked down at our boat and saw that the nose had got caught under the woodwork of the lock, and the rising water all around it was tilting it up. In another moment we should be over. Quick as thought, we each seized an oar, and a vigorous blow freed the boat and sent us sprawling on our backs. We didn't come out very well in that photograph. Our luck ordained that the man should take it at the exact moment when we were lying flat on our backs, with our feet waving madly in the air. In fact, very little else could be seen in that photograph, and all the other people refused to subscribe to it. And there was a good deal of unpleasantness. The man suggested that George and I should take 12 copies. We declined the offer. We said we didn't mind being photographed full length, but we preferred it to be the right way up. We reached Oxford that evening and spent 2 very pleasant days there. And then on the 3rd we set off on our homeward journey in the midst of a steady drizzle. We rode all day in the rain. We pretended at first that we liked it for a change, but towards lunchtime we hoisted the cover and kept it up all afternoon, just leaving a little opening at the front through which one of us could paddle and keep lookout. We didn't have a very merry evening. There was much cheerful talk about sciatica, fevers, chills. bronchitis and lung disease. Harris said how awkward it would be if one of us was taken seriously ill in the night, seeing how far we were from a doctor. The second day was exactly like the first. But on one thing we were all agreed, and that was that come what might, we would see this thing through to the end. We'd come out for a fortnight's enjoyment on the river, and a fortnight's enjoyment on the river we were going to have, if it killed us. Towards 4 o'clock, we began discussing our arrangements for the evening at Pangbourne. We mused on the prospect. We would finish our dinner at, say, 6:30, and after that we could wander about the town in the pouring rain, or sit in a dimly lit bar parlour and read the almanac. Why, the Alhambra would be almost more exciting, said Harris. With a little supper to follow, I murmured half unconsciously at the... And I named a capital little out-of-the-way restaurant where you can get one of the best cooked and cheapest little French dinners I know, and a bottle of Beaune for 3 and 6, and which I'm not going to be idiot enough to advertise. If we hadn't made up our minds, said George, to contract our certain deaths in this bally coffin, it might be worthwhile mentioning that I happen to know there's a train leaves Pangbourne soon after 5, which would land us in town in time for a chop, and then to go on to the place you mentioned afterwards. Nobody spoke, but we looked at one another, and each one seemed to see his own guilty thoughts reflected in the faces of the others. Silently we got out and overhauled the Gladstone. We looked up the river and we looked down the river. Not a soul was in sight. 20 minutes later, 3 men and a shamed-looking dog could be seen creeping stealthily towards the railway station. We'd deceived the boatman at Pangbourne. We hadn't had the courage to tell him we were running away from the rain. We'd left the boat and all it contained in his charge, with strict instructions that he was to have it ready for 9 o'clock the following morning. If, we said, if anything unforeseen should happen to prevent our return, we would write to him. We reached Paddington at 7 and drove straight to the restaurant, where we partook of a light supper, left Montmorency with orders for a full supper to be ready at 10:30, and went on to Leicester Square. We attracted a good deal of attention at the Alhambra. Our fine bronzed countenances and picturesque clothes were followed everywhere with admiring gaze. It was a proud moment for us all. We adjourned soon after the second ballet and wended our way back to the restaurant where supper was awaiting us. I must confess to enjoying that supper. For 10 days we'd had a simple, nutritious, but unexciting diet, and the odour of Burgundy and French sauces and the sight of clean napkins and long loaves knocked as a very welcome visitor at the door of our inner man. We pegged and quaffed away in silence for a while, until the time came when we leant back in our chairs and let our napkins fall to the floor and stretched out our legs under the table and held our glasses out at arm's length and felt good and thoughtful and forgiving. Then Harris drew back the curtain and we looked out at the street. It glistened darkly in the wet. The rain splashed heavily in the puddles. A few soaked wayfarers hurried by. "Well," said Harris, "we've had a pleasant trip, and my hearty thanks for it to old Father Thames. But I think we did well to pack it in when we did. Here's to 3 men well out of a boat." And Montmorency, standing up on his hind legs before the window and peering out into the night, gave a short bark of decided concurrence with the toast.